Today we find Jesus walking on the water, Peter joining him for a minute anyway. And I spent a lot of time thinking about this story as a kid. I don't know if anyone else is with me on that. But I had a hard time figuring out exactly what to do with this spectacular defiance of gravity. Miracles were not my problem. Feeding the 5,000, healing people, these things made sense to me as things that Jesus would do. But walking on water, come on, Jesus, you're just showing off now. One of the first classic novels that I read as a kid was Dr. Dolittle by Hugh Lofting. And I think that probably contributed to my first proposed explanation for the story. I thought, well, maybe Jesus called some friendly dolphins to give him a ride to the boat. As it turns out, there are no dolphins in the lake by Gennesaret. Maybe sea turtles. No, not that either. Well, if there were any creatures that were available to be giving Jesus a ride, it still, I thought, would be tricky in the middle of a storm of such intensity. So as I got older and wiser, I thought, well, maybe there was just a really long coral reef. I still think I wasn't quite aware this was a lake and not the ocean, but maybe there was a really long coral reef that Jesus walked on out to the boat. It would still be miraculous that he knew where it was, right? We could still give him credit. But then I went snorkeling with my family and found out the hard way that coral is sharp, not something you can just walk on. So I was back to square one, to Jesus walking on the water, and myself wondering, is that really you, Jesus? Can you really walk on water? And if you can do it, why? What are you doing out there? It's interesting to me that in reading this story, we sometimes find ourselves in the same position that Peter and the other disciples were in at the time, caught in this space between faith and doubt, asking the same questions. Is that really Jesus? Proposing similar tests. Well, if he can walk on water, why can't I? And really just generally unsure about what to believe. At first, for the disciples, they're dealing with a question of identity, right? And if we learn anything from the gospel stories, it's that Jesus is always escaping our criteria for him, always defying whatever picture it is that we are expecting. In the previous chapter of Matthew, after all of the kingdom of heaven parables have been told, Jesus asks the disciples, "Have you understood?" And they say, "Yes." In spite of their claim to understand Jesus' proclamation of God's kingdom, of God's rule, the disciples are terrified. Jesus' presence shocks them. In their minds, the sea was a symbol of chaos and evil. They did not have the Nat Geo channel with documentaries about the beauties of oceans and seas, right? The water was mysterious, scary, dangerous. In the Hebrew scriptures, the only one who walks on water is God, demonstrating God's power over those forces of chaos. Here's Jesus doing what only God can do, speaking with the voice of God, "I am." The posture of questioning that we find the disciples in is not necessarily a bad one, right? We can understand in an age of identity theft and internet scams, we kind of live in this posture. Anybody else? I know that some of you have received emails from someone claiming to be me, asking you to send them gift cards or transfer funds, and God will bless you and, increase your prosperity greatly. I will never, ever ask you for money or gift cards or anything like that over email. Just let me take this time to assure you. But that happens all the time, right? We have probably all felt a sense of betrayal if, from something like that, but even maybe things that hit closer to home from a friend or a significant other, or even a church that says that maybe it is welcoming, but then the deeper you get into that, you maybe feel not so welcome. You know what I'm talking about. I felt some of that betrayal this weekend dealing with neighbors who did not follow through on agreements that we made about big events, and so apologies if you saw the mess out there or if you had to deal with any traffic issues this morning. But when we look around at our world, we know that we can't always trust what we see. People are not always who they claim to be. They don't always do what they claim they're going to do. What makes Jesus so strange to us is that he is who he says he is. His word matches his action, and we're not used to that in our world. So we can be sympathetic to the disciples' skepticism, and I think that Jesus is sympathetic too. In response to their fear, he assures them, "Take heart, it's me. Don't be afraid." And this is kind of a mantra, right, that we get throughout the Gospels, from an unexpected pregnancy in the beginning to an empty tomb at the end. The people that are surrounding Jesus are surprised and afraid over and over again, and over again they are assured, "Don't be afraid, I've got you." It might seem that we would get used to this, the unexpectedness of Jesus, after reading all of these stories, but like the first disciples, we are often surprised, often a little nervous about where we find Jesus too, aren't we? The disciples thought that they had left Jesus back at the shore, just as we often think that we've left Jesus back there in history somewhere. So what do we do when he comes walking toward us? God's help often comes unexpectedly. That's the thing we can count on, ironically. It comes unexpectedly, illogically, impossibly, meeting us in our fear, not usually a flashing light that dispels the storm and darkness, but a presence that sometimes almost seems like a part of them, commanding the waves, being at home in the darkness, the mystery, the vulnerability. Jesus comes to us more as enigma than as white knight. He inspires more questions than answers. So the question for us is, the question for Peter and those original disciples is, can we recognize him? Can we recognize Jesus' presence when he comes to us in our distress? When chaos and evil is so prevalent, like a storm raging all around us, can we believe Jesus when he says it's him? When he comes to us in the middle of it all? Is Jesus' word enough for us? Well, for Peter, apparently not. Peter, whose impulsiveness is his blessing and his curse. Peter, who is portrayed boldly confessing Jesus as Messiah in one breath and in the next breath rebuking Jesus. Peter, who thinks it would be a good idea to build houses on the Mount of Transfiguration, who is chastised by Jesus for falling asleep in the garden, for chopping off a servant's ear. He is the disciple who is most confident of his fidelity, his faithfulness, and the disciple whose failure is most spectacularly displayed at the rooster's crow. You remember the story. Despite his eventual restoration, Peter is the disciple who goes in guns blazing, but has often missed the point entirely. So in typical Peter fashion, after Jesus' words of assurance, he blurts out, "Lord, if it's really you, tell me to come out there too." He puts Jesus to the test. I don't know, I wasn't there, but I would suspect it's not an act of faith, but a demand for proof, right? Prove it, Jesus. And Jesus says, "Come." Now, this is where I really wish we had like tone of voice indicators in the Bible so we could kind of get a better sense of what's happening here. Maybe Jesus is calling Peter forward here, saying, "Come and walk with me, my child," right? But it seems at least as likely in our context and with what we know about Peter and Jesus' dynamic that Jesus might just be humoring him, right? He might be more like, "All right, come on then. Let's see how this goes." So Peter tries to walk on water, and soon enough he starts to sink, as we know things do. In the early days of my ministry, like the dark ages, I spent some time as a youth intern. So if you can believe that, I used to be cool and fun and hip, but thank God for Lucas now. But in some of those days, I can remember a lot of pool parties. Now, I don't know, you guys have had some pool parties, I've missed them. But in the youth pool parties that I've been to and supervised, don't judge me for this, there was a game that my youth would play called Walk on Water. teenagers are very spiritual, even at pool parties, yes, I know. And so what they would do is they would line up these long, full-body floaties across the pool, and then get as far back to the fence as they could, take a running start through the grass, and see how far they could get running on the floaties, right? It was the early 2000s, y'all. We were not as concerned about safety then. Don't get any ideas for this summer. But I was pretty impressed sometimes with how far they could get before eventually, of course, they all went under. They could attest to what Peter found out, that sinking is a universal reality. We shouldn't fault Peter for sinking. Sometimes we give him a hard time for that. I think the problem is that he wanted not to sink. He wanted to be more than human. He wanted to be like God. It's a problem that we struggle with, and it goes all the way back to Adam and Eve, who ate from the tree, right, in order to be like God. Continues on through our history, where we ask God to prove God's self by doing something great on our behalf, or wanting God to let us do something spectacular, right? Jesus shows us how to be human. And Jesus also shows us who God is. And those are two different things. We confess as Christians that Jesus is not only human, but God incarnate. Like, he's fine with mystery that we can't quite explain, right? If he's okay with that, he's okay with us not being able to explain walking on water as well. But Jesus is God, something that you and I can't be, right? Something that we don't need to try to be. Our attempts at being like God will inevitably leave us drowning. Our job as disciples is not to walk on water, but to bring the ordinary humanness of who we are, of what we have, like the loaves and fishes of the little boy in the story right before this one, and let God work. As children of God, we can embrace our humanness. It's not a flaw, it's a part of what we were created to be. This is good news. Understanding who God is means that we can embrace who we are and know that we are enough as we are. We know Jesus not in our ability to instrumentalize him for our own purposes, not in our ability to pray and get what we want, right? But in trusting in his assurance that he is who he says he is. We know Jesus not in attempts at being extraordinary, but by bringing God's love to our world in all our ordinariness. The final portion of our story, Peter finally gets the evidence that he's looking for. Not by walking on the water, but in the moment that he can't. Peter cries out to Jesus, "Lord, save me, help," right? That classic prayer that we all know in the depths of our heart. Lord, save me. And lucky for Peter, it really is Jesus who doesn't hesitate in rescuing not only Peter, but the entire boat. The wind dies down as Jesus helps a drenched and sputtering Peter back into the boat. "Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt?" I can imagine Jesus slapping Peter on the back as he coughs up seaweed. Again, it feels like an ocean to me, and I know that that's not the case. What grows in a lake? He's coughing that up. At this point, for the first time in Matthew's gospel, the disciples get it. They say, "Truly, you are the Son of God." This is the first moment of worship. It's fun to make Peter play the fool in our stories, and I definitely support it. But it never fails. As soon as I start to roll my eyes at him, it's like a mirror turns around and faces me, which is why I really appreciate this Lent series. Because like the disciples, we are not often prompted to worship by our spectacular successes, are we? It's our moments of failure, our moments of grief, our moments of being vulnerable, our moments of confession, our moments of doubt. These are the moments that we are drawn to awe of the divine. Not when we get promotions or all A's, not when we miraculously overcome illness or defy the laws of gravity. Our faith is made known to us in the moments when a friendship fails, or when our child is sick, or when our own bodies start to fail us. When things don't turn out the way that we wanted them to, the way we expected them to. When we are in the chaos of our world and realize how little control we actually have. And Jesus reaches a hand out. The divine connects with us in the middle of our fear, in the middle of our vulnerability, our humanness, and says, don't be afraid. I've got you. I've got you. Beloveds, in order for us to have faith, we don't need to walk on water. Thank God. We need to recognize that we can't, and that's okay. The message of the text is not if he had had enough faith, he could have walked on water. It's also not if we have enough faith, we could overcome all of our problems in spectacular ways. The message is that Jesus comes to us in the middle of our storms, our weakness, our fear, our uncertainty, our doubt, our inability to miraculously fix those things is not a lack of faith. It's not, no matter how many times you've heard that before. Because doubt and faith have always gone side by side. Back to the story that we read today even. They've always gone together in the Christian experience. And sometimes, yes, we know one of those more acutely than the other. But the truth is that most of our lives we spend in the space in between, right? How do we navigate this space? Some of the first interpreters of this passage understood the boat to be symbolic of the church. I kind of love this, actually. If that's the case, then what we do is we don't abandon ship. One commenter writes, faith is daring to believe in the face of all the evidence that God is with us in the boat, made real in the community of faith as it makes its way through the storm, battered by the waves. The church doesn't get to avoid the storm any more than the rest of the world. And as the church, we don't get to avoid our mistakes, our failures. The community of faith doesn't teach us how to walk on water, but how to recognize Jesus when he's walking toward us. How to recognize ourselves, who we are, what we're made for, and how to fall into the arms of grace. We, beloveds, are God's creation, battered by the wind and waves, sometimes sinking like rocks, but we are able to cry out, to trust, to grab a hold of the divine, to steady us, to rescue us. Thanks be to God. Amen.